prepared to have that background. I'm actually going to talk a little bit about this. So yeah, as Tanai said, I started in philosophy of science. I've now been studying evolutionary psychiatry for basically 10 years. And yeah, I went to do my PhD in Zurich, where I worked in a lab with evolutionary biologist, a developmental psychologist, and an evolutionary anthropologist. And now I've come here and I'm working in an evolutionary anthropology team and working on psychology. So I've kind of had quite an interdisciplinary trajectory, but I'm going to talk a little bit more about these kind of conceptual issues like in between philosophy and science today, which really do plague, I think, all research and thinking about mental disorder. So it basically comes down to this question of like, what is mental disorder? We have this term disorder. We use it mostly for mental disorders. I don't really talk about physical disorders so much, but we also have all of these other words like disease, sickness, pathology, illness, dysfunction, condition, affliction, malady. Like these are kind of terms that are everywhere in our culture. Some of the first words you'll ever learn is like sick. Oh, are you sick? You're a little baby child and you're like, oh yeah, I'm sick. Oh, is daddy sick? This is like fundamental concepts. Like every single culture has some kind of concept of disease, right? We've used them for our whole lives. A lot of us are probably kind of working in and around these sorts of concepts. But what is it? What, like, actually, if you were asked like a scientific definition of what a mental disorder is, could you give a good answer? The answer is like almost definitely no, because the philosophy of medicine has basically been working for about 50 years, on and off, to kind of question like, well, what do we mean by disorder, both like scientifically and kind of ethically and from a practical perspective. So the way that I got interested in this question, this problem, the thing that kind of grabbed me about evolutionary thinking about disorder in the first place, 10 years ago, was recognizing this paradox, which I think really justifies the field and is a reason for everyone to kind of think about this more seriously. So here we have 165 individuals, half male, half female, half adult, half child. The reason there are 165 is because this is about the kind of demographic of your extended social networks as a hunter-gatherer. Most hunter-gatherers live with about this many people that they will kind of see around. You live in smaller bands, about 20 or 30, but those bands are part of these larger networks. This is quite similar to Dunbar's number of 150, if you know that, but this is actually taken from anthropological data. So basically, this is the amount of people for hundreds of thousands of years, probably even millions of years, that you would have interacted with. That's what our ancestors were kind of doing, is like meeting these people, living with them, surviving with them. So the paradox and the interesting thing here is that if you look at this sort of prevalence, the prevalence of like common mental disorders in this kind of number of people, then you would expect to find, because these are heritable conditions, they don't seem to be kind of related to like weird modern environments that much, and they do carry cross-culturally. We haven't done enough research in hunter-gatherers to actually find them, but they do seem to be implications, they are there. The point is, so theoretically, for hundreds of thousands of years, you'd have known people with ADHD, probably one person with schizophrenia, one person with bipolar, one person who is a psychopath. So we have like, this is the problem of mental disorder. Like evolution left us with all these traits. Pathology has not been able to explain it. We have assumed it as germs or disease or genes. And we've looked and we haven't been able to find anything which is explaining this prevalence. Instead, these are kind of blended into our kind of natural human psychology. And the paradox is like, why have we not all become neurotypical, basically? Why have we not all become mentally healthy? Evolution has been playing with us for hundreds of thousands of years, pushing our minds in certain directions. And it should have been able to remove all of this stuff, but it hasn't. So this is the paradox, like why? Whatever you're thinking about in terms of the brains which are behind them or the genes which are behind them, evolution should still explain why those genes persist, why those brains manifest in that way. If there are environmental factors which cause, depression or bipolar, then there should be an evolutionary reason why that particular environmental factor leads to this sort of brain state. So this is the paradox, and the paradox is not just about these people who are can actually be diagnosed, but about like the spectrums which sit behind every single mental disorder. So this is like the neurodiversity of humanity. This is really what we need to explain. And no paradigm has really been able to do this. We've been kind of like wondering, like, what is this? And so kind of recognizing this paradox is why I got really interested in like, well, is this really disorder or pathology as I've kind of traditionally thought about it and assumed? The answer is kind of, well, obviously no, but it's a complex question, which I'm going to get into today. So this basically justifies why I got into the field, why evolutionary psychiatry is interesting and promising, I believe. As Tanai said, I had a background in philosophy, was very aware that there's a lot of people giving kind of spurious or random evolutionary explanations, and like with varying scientific evidence. And so the first thing that I kind of knew when I got into this was like, well, we need like better, rigorous methods. I'm actually not going to talk to you about those methods today. They're in this paper that you can read. But this was like the core thing I went to do in my PhD. But what I am going to talk to you about today is like a problem that I recognized when I got to my PhD. Because I hadn't really noticed that this really strict definition of dysfunction or disorder was necessary to engage in this scientific process. We want to be able to like have a load of experiments or data we can gather to say, yes, this person has a disease and this person doesn't. You want like a strict line, right? However, as it turned out, the philosophy of medicine hadn't come to such a strict line, so I realized I had to do this in my PhD. So actually what I mostly spent my time doing, because I'd previously thought about the scientific method, what I mostly spent my time doing in my PhD was like this more conceptual stuff, like what truly is disorder and dysfunction? How can we properly delineate it? Okay, so if you go to evolutionary psychology and evolutionary psychiatry, you'll undoubtedly find the definition of disorder put forward by Jerome Wakefield in 1992, his harmful dysfunction model. And so basically Wakefield said that disorder exists wherever there are two kind of concurrent facts. So they have to be harmful. Whatever your state is, if it's depression or your eyes or whatever, if they're harmful, that's like one necessary factor. This is kind of obvious, like the things that are bad, yeah, we think they're bad, fine. Then the more interesting part, the kind of scientific part, to go beyond what culture believes is harmful, is thinking about biological dysfunction. So what is that? Like Wakefield defined this in terms of interruption of selected effects. So basically, your eyes were selected to see, so things which interrupt your eyes from seeing are kind of dysfunctional. Okay, so this is kind of quite appealing. It's become very popular. However, if you like scrape too much at the surface, you realize there's various criticisms. So it was absolutely a gift to me that this book was released in 2021 during the time of my PhD, which was 20 chapters of Wakefield's critics just kind of attacking his model in various ways, and 21 chapters of him responding, which is a ridiculous, gargantuan effort. And not only that, but unbelievably, I've met him, I've talked to him, and so he actually had to write this book twice because he'd written the whole thing and was in Las Vegas at a cafe, and it was on his laptop in his bag, and the bag just got stolen, and the whole book, which he'd been working on for years, just got stolen, and he hadn't backed it up, which is like, come on. But this was a few years ago, but you know, people don't use cloud, and he's a little bit older, so. Okay, so he had to rewrite the whole 20 chapters, mad. Apparently it was like the most depressed he's ever been. Anyway, so he also says that the first 20 chapters were actually much better, so whatever the proper book is. Anyway, he does admit that there are still criticisms. He doesn't really properly deal with all the criticisms. But I would say that even though this is the most popular evolutionary kind of definition of disorder, even the critics recognize that you need some kind of evolutionary principle to be able to define disorder and dysfunction. The basic reason is you need, if you're talking about like what biology should be doing and like where biology is going wrong, you need something kind of objective to say, well, what is the true thing that any biological thing should be doing? Evolution kind of gives us that thing. You can't just like arbitrarily say, oh, well, I don't like, you know, your sexuality or your personality. There is a historical fact that evolution led to, which was about basically reproductive success, fitness. This is like a strong objective standard which you can then reference to say, okay, well, this is disease or this is something going wrong because it was meant to do this in the past. That at least, basically all the critics kind of agree that that's like the promise of evolutionary principles. It's just that Wakefield's account doesn't actually do that sufficiently, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about why. So of the many chapters, I think about 16 of the 20 chapters are attacking the dysfunction component. I'm going to summarize the main criticisms. But one of them, for instance, is that you might have all these sorts of disorders where the tail of the disorder kind of is diagnosable, but actually it's related to something which is an adaptation. So it's kind of actually good to be anxious quite a bit about your exams or about whether you're going to make the train or whatever. And then at some point, anxiety can become overactivated, become a disorder, be diagnosable. It could be related to the same system. It's just like sometimes it gets pushed into this extreme, right? Now, that's obviously not like a simple dysfunction in the way that we kind of comprehend dysfunction. This is like a weird case where it's kind of an adaptation, but kind of not. it really challenges Wakefield's simple dichotomy of like, it's either functional or dysfunctional. So another problem is derived from this like big question that we think about in evolutionary psychiatry, which is there evolutionary mismatch? Evolutionary mismatch is just the concept that adaptations in the past can now become harmful today. So it might have been really good to be quite aggressive and fighty and, kill the occasional person for hundreds of thousands of years. Now that's not a good thing to do. We punish it. Now, the weird thing here is that if we start punishing behaviors by just saying, okay, no, your trait is no, we don't like it, we're going to lock you up. But the trait itself hasn't changed at all, then you've kind of destroyed the whole point of the scientific enterprise, or the desire from a definition of disorder, which is that it is truly objective and you can't just like decide. If I suddenly decide to like start locking up a person of your particular neurotype, you can't just say, well, now it's dysfunctional. Like that's obviously not what you want from the evolutionary story or the scientific explanation. Wakefield admits this is like a serious criticism. He tries to revise his definition a little bit, but it's kind of unsuccessful. I won't go into the details there, but basically this is a huge problem. Okay, there's this indeterminacy of selected effects problem. So, okay, eyes are for seeing, fine. That's like a nice intuitive function. Actually, okay, we define eyes as organs which see, so it's like a circular argument. But okay, but forgetting that, like thinking about like what the selected effects of your hands are, right? Like if you want to define something as dysfunctional, the idea is that you say, well, okay, hands are for this function, therefore anything that interrupts that hand function is a dysfunction. But clearly, like, it's really hard to describe, right? Like the things that your hands are going to do are very different to the things your ancestors' hands did, swiping on screens and whatever. And like, what are we trying to do? Are we meant to just like have this perfect description of what a hand's function is? Like the true reality of what your hands evolved to do is the story of every single one of your ancestors succeeding because of their hands, and like every niche thing that they did to make their hands like give them reproductive success. And that's the story, like hundreds of thousands, billions of individuals. And like you're meant to summarize it in one story and say, well, okay, but now it's dysfunctional because this is the story I'm going to give you to summarize that. It's just like unworkable, basically. Okay, so there's also this line drawing problem with this specific definition. So eyes are for seeing, fine. I don't need glasses, I have perfect vision, sorry. But like there is this question of like, do I really have perfect vision? Like I definitely have like looked into the sun a bit too much. Got the odd like stabbing in the eye. Like, it's probably done like very tiny differences. It's made like difficulties to my sight. Like in some way, my seeing has been interrupted by something I've done in life. Like you could look at like all of your biological functions, which are basically fine, and say, oh, but it's not completely perfect. I'm interrupting the selected effect of this particular emotion or this particular physical thing. So this just kind of completely devolves the whole point of the scientific standard, which is like, well, you want to be able to say that, no, this eye really is dysfunctional. You have this line drawing problem. You can always tell a story about dysfunction. Okay, so the upshot of this is that basically Wakefield's dysfunction component is just not workable scientifically. It comes from this like good place. It's actually quite simple. It's quite like easy to comprehend. But as his critics, and indeed myself, will point out, it's not precise enough. It's not conceptually clear. It's really, you can't really devise scientific experiments to test this. And one of the kind of obvious things that comes out when you're thinking about all these criticisms is that like this functional versus dysfunctional line kind of needs expanding. So okay, I realized I'd happily gone into my PhD assuming that, oh, Wakefield's account will sort it out, I'll be fine. Realized there's all these fundamental problems. I can't actually like really come up with a good scientific explanation or a method for discerning disorder from dysfunction. Need to actually solve this. Okay, how do you do that? Well, I didn't actually find this definition until I had already kind of worked it out, but it was good that Elliot Sober in 2000, a philosopher of biology, had worked out that like a really strict definition of adaptation kind of requires these components which are different to Wakefield. So basically, it's very philosophical, I'm sorry for this. But okay, his definition is characteristic C is an adaptation for doing task T. So eyes are an adaptation for seeing in a population if and only if members of the population now have eyes, because ancestrally there was selection for having eyes, and eyes conferred a fitness advantage because they performed task T. Okay, I've highlighted the important components here, which is separating objects of selection, which is like eyes, from processes, which is like seeing, and then also highlighting fitness. So these are basically the components which you can use to get a really nice strict definition of dysfunction and, well, maybe disorder, but we'll come to that. Okay. So I call it the fitness and function framework, the FAF. It is a little bit of a FAF. So the first thing you can do is think about biological objects, which is eyes, autism, depression, and you can categorize them by fitness very simply by saying adaptations increase reproductive success, passengers have no effect, disruptions reduce reproductive success. So I'm just including like positive, neutral, negative. Adaptations are eyes, freckles are probably passengers, disruptions, cancer, fine. Okay, so you can use fitness and distinguish these. Then you can also think about like the selection effects, like why is it that eyes, what are the processes that allow eyes to kind of give you positive reproductive success? Well, that's their function. Seeing is their function. Neutral processes have no effect, and dysfunctions are processes which reduce reproductive success. So I'm going to go into why this is like much better and fixes all of the problems with Wakefield. But the most the simple kind of fundamental thing to think about is that these are basically trios of positive, neutral, negative. And because they're kind of like fundamentally quantifiable, there's this they're much easier to kind of demarcate than these like messy functional stories. Then it becomes easier and crisper and allows us to really differentiate things into specific categories. Okay, so talking a little bit about why. I've already talked about how like complicated this question of, the function of hands is, right? Like when you get to the end of your life, what did your hands do for you to help you? It's completely messy, it's impossible to really describe. However, if you ask, well, did they improve your fitness? Are they good? You're like, yeah, sure, okay, fine. And you can think about that for like the hundreds of thousands, billions of individuals. You don't have to talk about like, well, what was the hand of my great-great-great-great-great-granddad doing? It doesn't matter. Like almost definitely they improved his fitness, right? So you have this very crisp, simple like definition line to say, yeah, okay, I don't have to tell you a whole story. I can just use evidence to infer that the hands were good. Yeah, and like fitness is fundamentally quantifiable. It's so beautiful. It's so nice. Biology is such a mess, it's all gloopy and like infinitely complex, and like whatever's happening is like different between every individual, and every case of depression is a nightmare, and it's so messy. But fitness, reproduction is like, it's so objective and simple. It's like, oh, does this individual blob like reproduce and make 2 blobs? Does this person with schizophrenia have like 1 kid or 5 kids? There's like a number, right? You can actually like pin it down to a number. It's so nice. So this is really satisfying when you're kind of working with all this mess of, oh, what is depression anyway? And like, well, oh God, yeah. Anyway, so fitness is nice. Fitness is crisp. Fitness is clear. It gives us this ability to like really divide a line, which we can then maybe use to think about what disorder truly is. And yeah, as I've kind of said, you escape having to precisely describe this whole functional process. It also allows for all the times when you might have like weird dysfunctional things which are kind of interrupting your selected effects or kind of bad for you. There are going to be times when you like put your hand in an oven, or you like pick up something that's poisonous, and like for that moment it's actually your hands were bad. Like you shouldn't have had hands, right? But like you can't use that and say, well, look, your hands are dysfunctional now. Like no, everything has like dysfunctional aspects and functional aspects. Every single element in your body can every cell can become cancerous. Everything takes calories. This is all dysfunctional in some way. It's kind of reducing, it's hurting you. Clearly you don't want to say that's all dysfunctional. So you allow for there are dysfunctional things, but you also say, but they're carried along by a bigger function, which is a trade-off basically. Okay, so that's some of the really nice kind of connotations there. It can also deal with this line drawing problem very simply. It's just like, well, okay, if you've got a bit of dust in your eye, if I looked at the sun for too long, did it affect my fitness? No, it didn't. The dust in my eye is very different to a bullet in my eye. One of them is going to be dysfunctional, one of them's not. You can just get rid of this ridiculous complexity of trying to draw the line and say, okay, well, did whatever happen affect your reproductive success? But okay, so we have this definitional framework, but to make it apply, and this is also something that Wakefield didn't really think about, you have to stipulate 2 things, specifiers I call them. Every evolutionary analysis actually needs this. There's no it doesn't make sense to even tell an evolutionary story without having these specifiers. The first one, which is kind of obvious in mental health and was sort of what was talked about last time, is that you could like define things differently, and exactly how you define the thing is going to lead to a different outcome in like whether it was good for fitness or not. So if you define autism in the way that we defined autism in the 1970s, you're going to come out with like a very different calculation to the way we define autism in 2025. These really matter. You have to be explicit about like what am I looking at here. Something interesting also happens when you like mix around these descriptive levels, because you could define autism with the various traits in the DSM or whatever, say from 2010, fine. Then you can say, okay, well, this is like 0.7% of the population. You can look at their fitness. You're like, oh, okay, yeah, they're actually doing quite badly. But you can like simultaneously look into the genes of those people and see that the genes are like being positively selected and associated with higher intelligence and higher educational achievement, which they are. So you have this like messy thing here where, okay, the thing that I'm describing at this level is like kind of a disruption, harmful, but at this more fundamental level, it's beneficial. You start to see where like you get a nice evolutionary explanation as to like why this paradox might persist, why we have this thing floating around in the population. So yeah, this basically leads to these two different types of dysfunction. On one hand, so case A here could be, it's like a gene or a trait which is like helpful for some people and harmful for other people. Like it can actually just be bad for some people. The clear example of this is sickle cell anemia. It's actually quite good for some people to have sickle cell blood cells and to have one copy of the gene, but it's bad for people who have two copies. So we could just be looking at the people with sickle cell disease and be like, oh my God, okay, well, you've got this disorder. But like there's a story of adaptation behind it, which is that like the general population was protected, or a lot of the population was protected from malaria. Okay, and then, or you could be looking at this kind of more like B-type scenario where you're defining autism and looking at all the costs and saying, oh, look, you're bad at socializing, you don't pick up these cues, whatever. But you might just be missing strengths in the same individual. And again, like evolution can allow this to persist, but we're just like defining the disorder in one case in like a person who's badly affected actually, but like at a population level it's better. In the other case, the individual is actually got like strengths which are counteracting it. These are like very distinct, clear types of disorder from an evolutionary perspective. And this case A kind of solves this problem of like, well, what about the adaptation, which is also related to disorder sometimes. Okay, the second specifier that we really need to consider is framing. So what is framing? It's just like, what environment are you in, basically? Like evolution never happens in a vacuum. You're not just like an individual floating in space who has autism. You're like a person in a forest or in a classroom for a particular period of time. And you could say, okay, well, I'm looking at, like what are the fitness consequences of schizophrenia in the last 100 years? You're like, oh, okay, it's really, really bad. Well, what about the fitness consequences of schizophrenia over the last like 100,000 years? Those are going to be different calculations. Okay, we're ignoring like the scientific problem of testing all this stuff. But still, the point is you do need to like frame something and say specifically, okay, this particular population, was it good or bad? The interesting example here is lactase tolerance. So for some pastoralist populations for the last 10,000 years who had cattle, then like a mutation happened that meant that they could digest milk. Probably most of us here, maybe 60% of us here, can like digest milk and into adulthood. But that was never adaptive for like hundreds of thousands of years. That mutation kept arising, but they were never around like cows basically, or goats or whatever they were drinking. Horses actually sometimes. Okay, so basically defining your population and the period of time over which the adaptation is meant to exist is really necessary. Wakefield kind of missed this. And when you do recognize that like there's different framings, it basically accounts for this mismatch example. You can just say, look, yeah, it's just true that people with ADHD or autism or schizophrenia are doing really badly in the last 50 years. But if you change the framing and you look over the last 100,000 years, the calculation changes. And that can explain its persistence in the population. And from this, you get a whole realm of like different categories of disorder, which are very nicely, crisply defined by fitness. God, it's lovely. And then so on the one case, then it's just like the thing is just bad for everyone. In case A. Case B, perhaps there's a trait which is like was adaptive historically, now has become actually still good for some people, but kind of bad for other people. So the same problem. Oh, sorry, that's number C. Apologies. So in that case, something like perfectionism, probably really good for ages, but now it's like a really high predictor of having an eating disorder in modern society. Okay, so the trait is like really good historically, now kind of good for most people, but in some people causes eating disorder. You can just have these costs like arise. And then case B, there could just be new harms which arise in new environments. But they're still okay for the individual, it's just that you might notice the harms. Okay, so these are again like different things. Okay, so what do we have here? We have the FAF, which is like this kind of, this final, like if you want to make any description of whether something's a disorder or not, you have to like be careful with your description, you have to say what the framing is. Then you can say, okay, well, it was either an adaptation, a passage, or a disruption, as shown by the evidence of the fitness of that biological object. And then you can start talking about all the processes which went into that if you want to. You don't have to, but you can. Okay, so this is the solution. But how does this, what does this mean, going back to this like historical question of like, what are mental disorders? You know, we have all of these labels for categorizing them, we know them all, but what do they really mean? Obviously, Wakefield really concentrated on this like dysfunction term, was like framing everything as function versus dysfunction. That's not exactly, that's obviously just not going to work. What you do really need is kind of basically 6 different types of dysfunction. One is just like dysfunction everywhere. The 3 are kind of dysfunctions of like various types because of new environments. And then 1 is just like dysfunction in one individual but not another, and then 1 is dysfunction in the same individual but you're just missing the strengths, okay? And you can see all of these as like disorder in some kind. When you're thinking about like, is this a true disease or not? Like, this is like the clear example. This is the thing that we've been using, like inspired by biomedicine, which has found germs and cancer and all this stuff, like clearly bad things, you can find the pathology. Clearly this is disease. And the problem, I think, in all mental health research has been like assuming that what we should be looking for is these things. However, that's just like not gonna happen. We haven't found any of those things in most cases. And also, if it were those things, then they wouldn't explain the paradox. Like these things shouldn't be that prevalent in the population. You'll notice that like almost all physical disorders arise late in life. Like mental disorders arise really early. Like they hit you at the time when you're meant to be reproductively successful. It's ridiculous. Like no disease should be arising when you're 15 and about to like become an adult. Like that's just not what disease should do. It's so visible to selection. The reason that all of the other disorders arise late in life is because there's just like no selection. You've already had your kids. It doesn't really matter. You get cancer, whatever. This is clear disease. Okay. These two, I think, are like very obviously kind of adaptations. You know, we definitely shouldn't be calling these like true disorder. I don't really have like a strong opinion on any of this. I have a strong opinion about whether this is like these are objective categories, but whether you want to call them disease or not is like, that's a social problem. But definitely like these cases seem kind of fine, like the person's kind of fine. Then in these like middle categories, it's like messier, like there are individuals who are really suffering. The person with sickle cell disease definitely does, like you probably should call that a disease and think of that as a true disorder. Maybe the word disorder is just better here. Yeah, I mean, so this is my kind of take on like each of these 6 categories. As I say, this is like the question of how you label things is ultimately social, and I can't prove anything. There's nothing derived from evolutionary theory which you can like prove there. Okay, but then, okay, does this matter? From a medical perspective, like to medical practice, does this really matter? Like, does it matter if you have an evolutionary explanation? Does it matter which of these 6 categories you fit into? So this is a big enough problem that was another chapter of my PhD. I should say that these are both preprints. I just haven't had the time. They're also too long to fit in most journals. Anyway, but I will in the next year or 2 be publishing this. But you can access them online. They're in my PhD as well. Okay, so this question of like, does this matter to medical practice is like very obvious. And oh, if I tell you that ADHD is an adaptation, or that, you know, like autism is like an adaptation at the genetic level, but not in the single individual who's like extreme. Does that matter? Okay, so I go into this in the paper. I can't go through all of it now, obviously, but I would say that one thing that Wakefield does, which I think is wrong, is that he says that you kind of need both harm and dysfunction are necessary components. Like, so he kind of puts them on equal weighting. If there's no dysfunction, then it's not a disorder. So if you prove that ADHD is not really like it was an adaptation or still is kind of okay, then to Wakefield that means you should call it not a disorder anymore. Now, maybe. But he concentrates on whether you should call it a disorder, not whether you should medicalize it and treat it. He does accept that you should treat it in many situations. My point is that medical practice really always acts on values alone. So I take these kind of like this harm and this dysfunction component, and I recognize that in the title, there's a hierarchy. Like medicine basically should always act to like prevent harm, almost by definition. Like if you see there's harm, there's like a moral imperative to treat it. If you didn't think you should treat it, you wouldn't call it harmful. So medicine should always just be acting by values. However, I think there is a really important thing to note about like, well, where do values come from? They're not in a void. Like the reason that you decide to get treatment for your ADHD is like a result of all of this messy, complex, like what religion you have, do you have money, do you have insurance, which country are you in? Like there's all of these questions about like whether we choose medicine and whether we think medicine should act. And one of those, particularly in the last, 100 years, one of those massive considerations is like, well, what's the scientific explanation of this particular trait? In the case of ADHD and depression, etc., like we've had these scientific explanations kind of floating around, bad scientific explanations, wrong scientific explanations, but definitely affecting our values about whether we should treat. So for instance, if you think that everything's a chemical imbalance and depression is chemical imbalance, there is this implication that I should take the drug to fix the chemical imbalance. And that basically becomes a value. Like, you know, does science matter really definitively, like necessarily for whether we treat something? No matter what the science is, it doesn't really matter. People can just like deny it, it doesn't matter. The evolutionary explanation, does that matter? Yeah, I think that often the evolutionary explanation, maybe even uniquely amongst most scientific explanations, can affect our values for like what we should do about this problem. For instance, ADHD. If you think ADHD is mostly a problem of mismatch of one of the kinds, there's this implication that we should be like trying to change environments a bit more, we should look for strengths. We do end up like changing our value system around that. And it's not a necessary link, but it is part of this hierarchy of values. This is my argument. Does it matter to scientific research? The simple answer is yes. And there's like too many ways to think about why. But for instance, like if you're putting everyone in the brain scanner, but you have, for instance, like autism if you have the autism diagnosis, could actually fit into like several of those different evolutionary defined categories at once. You can have autism which is caused by de novo mutations, you can have autism which basically looks like a strength, but we're just like describing the problems associated with it. These clusters, these diagnostic criteria are just really messy. This is like a nice objective, if you can actually do the science, which is messy, but at least conceptually, there's like a nice objective criteria for you to kind of cluster disorders together, look at them differently, look at maybe like spectrums, look at like cross-culturally, do these traits arise? Yes, I mean, there's like thousands of things that I think that this matters for. But yes, I will finish there. Thank you. If you want to reach out for a coffee or a beer, just email me. Thank you to my funders. We've recently set up a charity in the UK, which is hoping to fund bright young people who are interested in funding this interested in working on this research. We're also looking for philanthropists, if you know philanthropists who are looking. I've got a few I can think of, but yeah, we'll see. I also have a podcast on evolutionary psychiatry if you want to kind of get chased up with this stuff and you like podcasts. I look forward to discussing this with you.